Thanks very much, Gregor. In fact, the first thing I was going to say was that these thoughts come from discussions with yourself, Christian, Nicola, about the CRIMT experiment and trying to develop a paper about this, which we've been discussing off and on for a while. So, yeah, it's a pleasure to share my thoughts. I think I got one of those summons that I guess a number of people get from Gregor, which says, please would you do this? It really won't take you long to prepare. And then you sit down and think, oh my God, what am I going to say? So I guess I need to start by saying what an amazing set of papers that we've received and that we've been listening to in terms of different forms of experimentation, institutional, organizational, etc. And in a sense, the diversity of all of that is both our curse and our triumph because it shows the great scale of things, but how do we put any sense around this? How do we make these things comparable? And in that respect, I'm going to go back to 3 terms that I think are the key terms and ask you maybe to consider that if we unpack these terms, these may be ways in which we can start to get some sort of framing for the whole, for how we're going to present this research in its totality, or not in its totality, but to a major degree out into the academic world and into the world of practitioners. So I'm going to concentrate on the 3 words that are there: organizational, institutional, and experimentation. I think if we can look in a bit more detail at these words, they start to open up, hopefully, comparisons that we can make. So to start with, experimentation. Now, this term has been used a lot in the sessions that I've been attending, and I think everybody wants to believe and wants to use this language of experimentation. But I guess my first sort of point is let's think a bit more about what it means to engage in experimentation. And I think if we do that, we also start to, as I said, sort of see some topics and some connections there that maybe we weren't necessarily so aware of. So starting with the first 2 circles, basically, cognitive challenges and real-world change, and then the search for new solutions. I think we have an agenda here about ideas and about what ideas are dominant and what frames of reference are dominant. We heard in the plenary yesterday about the notion that the frames that we bring to analyses already shaping what the instruments of research are going to be and what the possible solutions are going to be. And I think in the world that we're looking at, I think we're all implicitly working on the basis that sometime over the last 30 or 40 years, the realm of ideas was captured by neoliberalism. And I think just saying it like that very starkly is not actually all that helpful, because what we now have are much more detailed accounts of how that process works. In other words, how ideas about how we should organize get promoted in certain think tanks and through certain networks, and then through certain academic disciplines, and then into administrators and policymakers, etc. And so we start in terms of the orientation of CRIMT, I think, from the point of view of thinking, well, what are these new ideas that we want to establish? And people have been talking about, what new ideas might replace neoliberal economics. I don't think we're in that game yet, but certainly I think the focus on, what are the ideas that and where are they coming from that are generating the sorts of experiments for better forms of work. And here, I think we could do more in terms of making explicit what those are. So I think the first stage in terms of the cycle of experimentation and what we look at is to think what new ideas are being introduced here, and what ways are they being framed, and are they being addressed and being put into the realm of new solutions. And then the second stage is what are the resources to actually put these solutions into practice. And again, I think we could unpack this circle and talk about things like the human side of this, like the technological side of it, the financial side of it. So in any particular process of experimentation, what are the resources that are necessary? And then the final thing that I want to, obviously there's the whole process of implementing an experiment, but then the final thing that I, again, would emphasize that in experimentation, we are talking about some sort of cycle, some sort of continuous process whereby we monitor, reflect, and learn on what's going on. So I think it would be helpful, one way in which we can compare our cases is to compare them in terms of a cycle of experimentation. Where are the ideas coming from? Where are the resources coming from? How are we implementing them? How are we learning from them? How are we diffusing from them? Now, the second thing I'm going to present is a typology, but I want to start by emphasizing again what I think is an important distinction, which is the distinction between experimentation at the organizational level and experimentation at the institutional level. To me, these are two very distinctive things. Firms, organizations, etc., are continuously, it seems to me, engaged in forms of change and experimentation. But that's not the same as saying that something has become institutionalized. To become institutionalized is to reach another level of embeddedness in the social order, whether it's through law or whether it's through repeated practice or whatever. So let's try and keep these two things separate to start with. And so looking at the drivers of organizational experimentation, I think here I'm probably going to spread the net a bit more widely than people might like or might think is relevant, because I'm going to identify, in terms of main actors, not just business and trade unions, not just the state, but I want to firstly unpack the idea of the state so that we distinguish between national governments and from all those that are subnational. Now, I apologize, this is very much a, what do they call it, helicopter view, but I think that in terms of actors who are driving organizational change, we can distinguish business to start with, national governments, local and regional governments, trade unions, and then an important category for me at least, current research, is that of civil society, that of social enterprises, co-ops, and social movements. So each of these is going to be driving organizational change for different reasons, with very we know that the main purpose of business is primarily going to be around increasing shareholder value. There are various ways in which that becomes part of business proposition. And we know, reading across now, that business has huge amounts of power within the workplace to drive experimentation, to manage, to take control, and to develop new models. And Schumpeter talks about creative destruction. I guess that many people would say this is not creative, but it's certainly a form of continual destruction. I like that Marx quote, all that is solid melts into the air, because capital business, it has no particular loyalty to any particular organizational form, to any particular product market, to any particular governing arrangement with labor. It will move as and, like water, it will move as and where it can find space and new things to do. And there's been a couple of sessions about things like Uber. And if you think about the speed, I think it was 2014 that Uber started in Montreal, the speed with which these models sort of emerge and are pushed through, and then the disruptive effect of those. This is really this is capitalism. This is its logic. I was thinking of that parable of the frog and the scorpion. The scorpion says to the frog, "Please, can you carry me across to the other side of the river?" The frog says, "But if I do that, you'll sting me and kill me." The scorpion says, "No, I won't, don't worry." Halfway across, the scorpion stings, kills the frog, and they both sink. Why did you do that? It is in my nature. It is in capitalism's nature to be disruptive. None of these other actors have that sort of logic built into them. That's why I think we're always sort of finding ways, how do you hold back the tide? Now, characteristically, we did think that national governments could hold back the tide, that they could rebalance the playing field. But, and certainly during the period of Keynesianism, that was happening. But I think that now, this is the arena that I'm most pessimistic about, and I think, well, other than what capital will be doing, obviously, but in terms of holding back the tide is in there. That, don't know what the metaphor is, but the governments are turning on the tap. They want more of this water to flow. They're turning themselves into this, being integrated into business, competition state, managing austerity. National government controls still key macroeconomic levers, but it's been significantly hollowed out. It's limited what it's going to do to drive independent sorts of experimentations. It's going to be mainly supportive of business or divisive of new efforts of the sort that we're interested in. But I have more optimism about local and regional governments. I think we should be focusing on, in the different sort of structures that we have across different countries, the pressures on local and regional governments that are in some ways more immediate about, we've all got to live in this city, we've all got to live in this region. So if we're losing jobs all the time, if we're destroying the environment all the time, this is affecting rich and poor in many cities, obviously unequally, but nevertheless, it creates some potential, I think, to mobilize limited resources and communities. So I'm sort of, I think that there are ways of thinking about local and regional governments as being drivers of organizational experimentation that can be effective. Some of you may have seen the book, If Mayors Rule the World, obviously joking about that, but nevertheless, it says something about if there was more power at the local level. And I think the development of the foundational economy work based at Manchester University, also with its focus on the everyday of the economy and things that we can control, on capital that doesn't have the same sort of mobility as, say, manufacturing. So supermarkets have to be in a particular location. Utilities like electricity, gas, water, they have to be in a certain location if they're going to make some money out of it. And so they become possible targets, possible ways of exercising or engaging with experimentation. Now, trade unions, I mean, this has been a major focus of many of the papers that I've listened to, and clearly, I don't think I've heard an optimistic word said about trade unions in this future, although there's maybe some people, I mean, Gregor and colleagues, still hankering for partnership and looking for signs of partnership. Maybe it's there. But then the final one that I want to suggest we consider is civil society, social enterprises, co-ops, social movements, which are new forms that are emerging of organizations and old forms that are re-energizing, that are growing in legitimacy and in visibility. And the problem of scaling these up. So I think we could start to maybe systematize our research along the lines of what are the drivers of organizational experimentation. And then, so my argument is that you can get all these experiments at the organizational level, but until they become normalized, until they become embedded, they are not, they don't count to me as institutionalization. And it's when you get institutionalization, embeddedness, that you can start to see momentum starting to emerge. But I think for this, we should also consider, well, okay, what are we talking about with these institutions? And again, if we go back to the classic sort of institutionalist analysis that says there are these spheres, let's look and let's specify what we think, what institutions we think are changing, being experimented with, etc. So law, regulation, finance, education, skills and training. A lot of the discussion here, go back to the point about partnership, has been about collective bargaining and what that might be transmuted into. But my point is really, let's try and be a bit clearer about what sort of institutions we think are being experimented with and are being changed. And related to that is creating what are the new institutions that are emerging and how do they emerge? And here again, I think we can use a lot of stuff that's already been discussed as Strake and Tailing on institutional change, that we could be thinking, well, okay, what's going on here? Are institutions being, old institutions being converted? Are old institutions being destroyed? Are they being bypassed? Is there some sort of layering? Again, what are the different processes of institutional experimentation that we see? So my final effort to create another typology is, okay, so let's look at these main actors again and think about what their capacities are in relation to institutions and institution building. Again, if we start with business, with capital, its capacity to destroy old institutions is high. Its capacity to convert, to bypass. Basically, and we're all sort of implying this, or many of us are implying this anyway in the research that we're doing, Capital has the whip hand in terms of what it can do to convert institutions. And it can do that in quick time because of the speed with which it gathers together resources, creates business plans, puts them in place, etc. National governments have a more complex capacity to engage in institutional experimentation, in part because at the moment there's still some sort of democratic accountability, and depending upon what sort of structure of governance we've got, there are embedded capacities to resist the destruction of old institutions. So national governments have a limited capacity to reshape the institutional landscape quickly. Over the longer term, we can see that they incrementally can make these sort of these changes. What they can also do is be short-term, highly disruptive. And the politics of the current era is characteristically politics of short-termism, in which highly disruptive actions around, for example, immigration, can have an immediate impact. What about local government? Well, here, of course, their capacities, we're going sort of down in terms of what they can do, but summarize my position, I think they can readjust the local landscape to a limited degree. What about trade unions? Well, again, some capacity to convert and extend in limited spheres. Civil society, I think we could unpack this a bit more, and I think that the activities that are happening around the idea that organizations should have a social mission, that organizations should take account of sustainability agendas, should take account of work-life balance, and setting up organizations like that, co-ops and social enterprises, I think that is having some sort of effect on the legitimacy, on the idea that there's only one way to organize, and that is characterized by a private ownership structure. I think this group is not able to reshape, but it is able to extend and diversify. And I think it would be helpful in terms of maybe some of the studies that have been conducted to think about, well, who are the main actors that are engaged in this process of institutional experimentation, and what are their capacities, and what is the consequence for the institutional landscape. And just to finish off then, I think that gives us a chance to ask questions like, what makes institutional experimentation possible for the various actors? And taking those actors where I think that there's more potential maybe than we previously recognized, local governments, trade unions, civil society organizations, to develop institutional experiments. How can we extend the capacities to make that possible? What are the key institutions that can be affected by those sorts of actors? And what institutions can be built around money, around alternative forms of finance, around alternative forms of access to technology and knowledge, around utilizing anchor institutions, big universities, utilities, etc., to local government employment to make a difference, to establish new and better ways of working. And are these experiments scalable? To what degree is there learning across locations, across sectors? And finally, this relates to creating knowledge of the sort that I think that is Gregor's ambition, to have CRIMT case locker where people can say, well, you know, we're a local government organization. We want to look for new ways of organizing vocational educational training. What examples can you give us of where that has been successful and why? And so there is a big job of learning, creating the learning and supportive networks. And, you know, obviously, congratulations to Gregor and Christian and the CRIMT people for trying to push this agenda forward. Just a couple of other points. What hope for national politics? Well, none. What hope for business and corporate governance reform? Well, let's say limited at least. Thank you very much.